Go for it.
I'm gonna hit okay. I gotta hit okay. All right, y'all. So here we go. Crochet gauge. Show of hands in the chat room. How many of you have actually ever done a gauge swatch or attempted to achieve gauge? I'd like to know that first off. Good. I see Linda's hand jumps up. She was like, yes, I have. Good for you, Linda. So gauge is a series of numbers. It's the number of stitches and rows that the designer has used to get the final measurement of the piece you're trying to make. So when you're making blankets and scarves and shawls, and people tell you, oh, gauge isn't that important. They're pretty much right. If you aren't really concerned if yours comes out a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller, you don't really have to strive too much to get gauge. However, you have to remember that if you happen to get a larger gauge, you're going to use more yarn, so you might have to purchase more yarn. But when you're attempting to make things that are meant to fit, like a sweater or a pair of socks or a hat or mittens, gloves, anything along those lines, gauge, becomes a lot more important, because it's like, okay, I want to make this size medium sweater. If I want to make this sweater based on these instructions, my stitches have to measure this. And how do we get this? All right. So you've probably seen on balls of yarn, it's like I have a Karen cake here. You've probably seen on balls of yarn, like on the back here, they have these the list here where it has the weight of yarn is a 4, and then it shows a pair of knitting needles, and it says US size 8, and it says 4 inches by 4 inches, and it says 18 stitches and 24 rows. And then it has a crochet hook, and it says 13 single crochets and 14 rows. That is the recommended gauge for the yarn that the yarn company puts on those ball bands. So on this particular ball band, it's saying that with a size H or a US size 8 crochet hook, you should be able to get 13 single crochets and 14 rows with this yarn. Now, does that mean that that's the only gauge this yarn can get? Absolutely not. That's just I'm going to say it's just a generic number that the yarn company puts on there based on what their experience is, how they imagine this yarn to drape, how it needs to be put together. Now, a designer can come along and say, okay, I'm going to use a size H, but maybe I get 15 single crochets. I don't get 13, I get 15. Or maybe they get 10. Well, that's totally fine. And what that designer would do on their pattern is use the number they get, because they are going to write their pattern based on the gauge they are using to make an item. Are you with me so far? It's a lot of math stuff. It's pretty basic, right? If you have a bed and you want to make your bed, you're going to buy a sheet that is a full-size sheet if you have a full-size bed, right? But if you're like, oh, I have a full-size bed, oh, there's a sheet right there. I'm not going to pay attention to what size it is. I'm just going to grab it. And you buy a king-size bed, all of a sudden you're going to have a really big sheet on this little tiny bed, right? We want to make sure that we are making our garments to be the right sheet size for our bed, our garments to be the right size for our body. Does that make sense, right? In order for us to do that, we must achieve gauge, all right? So that gauge number is very important. Now, if you haven't put this together, what I've said before, or what I just said about the gauge on the ball band versus the gauge that the designer puts in the pattern, gauge is subjective to the person making the pattern. For me, I will do a swatch up. So I will make up a swatch, and I will measure this swatch to figure out how wide this is. Now, this is obviously a motif, so I would figure out what are the measurements, the width and width of each motif. But if it was a swatch where it was just worked back and forth, I would count how many stitches I have and how many rows I have, and I would say, okay, for this full series for this full stitch pattern, it's X number of stitches and X number of rows equals whatever it may be. And then I can make that decision of how many of these do I need to put together to create the back of my sweater. You know what I mean? So we're just taking little nuggets of information to create bigger projects. And so it is subjective to the designers. Now, I am positive that if we were all in the same room and we all were using the same yarn, the same hook, and chaining the same number of stitches and working the same stitches, 9 times out of 10, we would all get different stitch gauges because we all crochet differently. So when a designer puts the gauge on a pattern, you need to work up a gauge swatch, starting with the recommended hook and ideally the recommended yarn, or at least the same yarn weight as the designer used, and start there. Now, does that mean that's your end all and be all? If you don't get it with that, you're done. That's it. I'm out. I'm not making this project. No, that's not what that means. That means we just did a test, right? That was our tester spoon of cookie dough, right? You're like, I need some more chocolate chips. So we change our hook size. So we change our hook size. We use the same yarn, use a different hook size. We go up or down depending if we need more stitches or fewer stitches. And we do another gauge swatch. Does that mean you could have 3 or 4 gauge swatches? Absolutely. But you know what? I'd rather make a gauge swatch this big than a 2X sweater to fit me that doesn't fit at all. And then I've put in hours of work and lots of stitches and it doesn't fit. I'd rather take the time to make this. Okay. So you, as a crocheter, are responsible for taking that pattern, looking at the stitch gauge, looking at the row gauge, starting off with your yarn, your hook, and make up your swatch. And we're going to talk about the size of your swatch here in just a minute. You make up your swatch, you measure it, you're like, I'm getting too many stitches. So that means your stitches are too small. Because if you're getting too many, your stitches are too small, right? If you're getting too few, your stitches are too big. So you would go up a hook size or down a hook size. Now, I want you to listen to me. Everybody hear me? Can you hear me? I'm getting really close. I'm going to tell you this because this is super important. I don't care if you have to go up or down a hook size or 4 hook sizes. You need to get gauge. It doesn't matter what hook size you're using in theory, or in reality, I should say. It's important that you're getting gauge. And if you need to use a K hook and the designer used an H hook, who cares? You're using a K hook, but you're getting gauge and you're going to get a piece that fits. So when I have people tell me all the time, well, I crochet to gauge. I don't have to do a gauge swatch. No, I'm sorry. That's not the truth, you guys. Take that out of your vocabulary. And why is that not the truth? Because gauge is not a standard. Gauge is subjective to the designer who has written the pattern. And gauge is subjective to how you crochet or how you knit. You guys all with me so far? Yes? Awesome. All right. So have I explained enough the importance of, or not the importance, the importance of gauge, what those numbers mean to the pattern? We're good there? Good. I'm going to make sure I'm looking at the rook. So if you nod your head, I can see you. That helps a lot. Perfect. I'm always telling my kids, I'm like, okay, let me know. Okay, so we know why we have this number, but you can see it now and be like, well, what do I do with this number? What does it really mean? How do I do that? Well, let's take a look at my hands and take a look at a pattern and look at some of the swatches I've done, and hopefully I'll explain it better that way. So I'm going to come down here to my hands, and I'm going to say, it keeps asking me if I want to unmute, and I do not. All right, so I have a bunch of different tools here, right? I have a knit check, which, it's just called a knit check. I have a tape measure, which is very important. I have a calculator, which you could use your phone if you want. I'm going to move those aside. I have a swatch in Works, and I have 2 different patterns here and a bunch of other swatches. So let's take a quick glance at these 2 patterns. All right, so they're just 2 free patterns on Yarnspirations. You can get them if you want, but what I'm concerned about here is right here where it says gauge. So in this pattern, we have gauge, and it says 11 single crochet and 12 rows equal 4 inches. So somebody might say, all right, does that mean I just make a square that is only 4 inches? You could, but I'm going to talk to you about why I think it's more important you make a larger size square, okay? But in theory, yes, you could make a square that's only 4 inches and see if you get this measurement, all right? Because it's only single crochets. We aren't worried about a stitch pattern. Whereas in this one, you can see it says 2 pattern repeats, so it's 30 stitches equals 12 rows, which is important and different than the other one, right? Because we're talking about full repeats. And so like if you were to look at the chart, it would be this full chart here equals 5 inches. And so you could just go ahead and just do up this chart to work up your gauge swatch and see if this chart measures, or once you get your swatch done, if this measures 5 inches. But can you see how that's different than the other one where we're talking about just plain stitches, because we're just talking about single crochets? But this pattern, because it's more complex, here we are, because it's more complex, we're talking about stitch pattern repeats, which is typically, not typically, it's really only something I ever find on crochet patterns. I never find that on a knitting pattern. And that's because crochet patterns, you know, I mean, we have a lot of different stitches that can go into making an actual stitch pattern itself. Whereas knitters, you know, it's usually they're knitting or they're purling. You with me so far, everybody? Yes? Cool. So when you get this information, this is your starting point. So because now the designer has told you, these are the numbers I use to make all of this work to achieve the size that is written. So you could start here, you could take the croquette yarn, you could start off with the C hook, and you could start your chains and work up that chart. All right, you could work up that chart and see if it measures 5 inches. Or on the other one, you could grab your Karen 1 pound, your size I crochet hook, and then chain an amount. Like I would actually probably do double this. So I would chain more than 11 single crochet. So I would chain 22 plus 1 for your turning chain, and then just single crochet back and forth and measure that. That's what I would do. Now you might be saying, well, if I only need to know what measures 4 inches, why would I want to do it bigger? And I'm going to show you that now. I know I keep asking if I'm with you guys, but I know there's a lot of numbers and stuff, so I want to make sure I'm not losing you. So please make sure if you have questions, ask in the chat room and let me know. All right, so right here in this purple little piece, I think I did 32 double crochets. I can go back and I can count. And it's obviously larger than 4 inches, but I'm okay with that because I can look at this and I know exactly how many double crochets I have. Let's just say it's 32. And I can take my tape measure, and I would usually make this taller, but it is what it is right now. And I could take my tape measure and I can measure across here, and I can say that we're just, a little bit over 9.5, but I'm going to cut it off at 9.5 because this is really just my turning chain sticking out there. So I have 9.5 inches. All right. So if we know that I have 32 stitches, can you guys see that? Yeah. So I have 32 stitches, and if I divide that by 9 inches, I know that I get 3.5 stitches per inch. All right, so let's write that down real quick. I'm going to show you something. So 3.5 stitches per inch. Do you guys ever remember in math class, the math teacher always told you to identify what your number was? I always got in trouble because I never did that. And now as a designer, I'm like adamant. I always have to list what my numbers mean because otherwise I'd forget. So we have 3.5 stitches per inch. So let's say we wanted to make a baby blanket and we just wanted to use double crochets. And we're like, you know what, I'd like to be a little bit more precise. So let's say I want about 45 inches in width. Okay, I want my baby blanket to be 45 inches. Well, I know that it takes 3.5 stitches per inch. So if I take my 3.5, let's take 3.5 stitches per inch, and I multiply that by the total number of inches I want my baby blanket. So I'm going to multiply that by 45 inches. So that's 157.5. So I'm going to say 157.5 stitches equal 45 inches. You with me? Now, obviously we can't do a half a stitch, so you would decide whether you want to round up or down. But this is how, when people are like, how many stitches do I cast on, or how many stitches do I do to make a baby blanket or a full-size blanket or a king-size blanket? This is how you figure it out. You figure out how many stitches per inch you're getting, or conversely, this could also be how many stitch pattern repeats. If we were to just measure our repeats across, we'll talk about that here in a minute. Once you figure out how many repeats, you multiply that by the desired size, and that gives you the number of stitches you would need. Make sense? I see some of you, you're like, oh my gosh, it makes sense. Like it's pretty basic arithmetic, you know what I mean? It's just like, okay, I have this number. I want this number. So if I take this and I multiply it by this, I'm going to get this. You know what I mean? It's like, it's not super difficult. And the same thing goes for rows. So I didn't measure my rows on here, but let's just see. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rows, and I'm about 3 1/4. So we have 3.25 inches equals 7 rows. So if we were to take, 7 divided by 3.25 inches, so we get 2.15 rows per inch. Okay, so let's say we want our baby blanket to be about square. So we want it to be 45 inches. Well, we know it takes 2.15 rows to complete 1 inch. So once again, we would take 2.15 rows and multiply that by 45 inches that we want. So we would need 96.75 rows to equal 45 inches. Now again, you can't do 3/4 of a stitch, so you would round up or round down and decide from there. So if any of you are desiring to make a double crochet blanket out of Karen cakes, I used a size H hook, and you now know what my gauge is. So you could try and achieve the same gauge, and you could make a baby blanket this size. Ta-da, you just designed a blanket, right? So it's really that easy. Now, notice I did not say, all right, so I have this swatch. Let's just measure 4 inches and then count how many stitches we have in that 4 inches. You want to know why I don't do that? Because I always miscount. Always. I always will miss a half a stitch. I will always miss a 1/4 stitch. I mean, look here. So even here, if I set this down and you go across, it's just a little bit into that stitch. But if I know exactly that I have 32 stitches, you know, I can say, all right, so 32 stitches, it's 9.5 inches wide, and you can decipher down from there. So don't feel like you're obligated to stick with that 4-inch mark. I often will make larger swatches for that very reason, and you actually get a more accurate reading if you measure over a larger distance. So these little things, they're handy, they're good, they work in a pinch, but I think I just explained why I don't really use this so much, because if I set this down, still, if I'm reading 2 inches and 2 inches, I don't get a full grasp of what my gauge really is, as well as when I know I have 32 stitches and I can measure. Does that make sense? Yes? Now, I'm not saying these are not handy. They are handy. But I find this to be better, especially if I'm doing any sort of a garment that has to fit, because your fabric will act differently too on a larger swatch than a smaller swatch. You could crochet tighter on a smaller swatch, but as you start to get some fabric on it, you could see that you kind of relax a little bit. And it's important to know that. So having a larger swatch is very important for that reason. You with me so far? Okay. So I'm going to move this all aside. Are there any questions, Allie?
So we have a question. As usual, somebody wants to know where your hook is from.
I'm sorry. All right. So so this is a Susan Bates hook, and I go to Etsy, and a person makes these handles and puts it on the hook. Because I crochet so much and I hold my hook like a pencil, I get cramps. And so this handle has really helped me so that I don't hurt myself. So it's a Susan Bates hook. It's just a handle, and you can make your own handles. You could do all sorts of things, but that's all it is. So I got it on Etsy, but it's still a Susan Bates hook. So sorry, I can't use the other ones. They hurt my hand, and it's not because of the hook. It's just the nature of the beast, right? So yeah, that's my hook.
So we have a couple questions here. So 2 people have actually asked, if you do a gauge swatch, generally, will you have enough yarn to still complete the project?
That is a very good question. So because we are all smart crocheters and we want to make sure we do our due diligence and do our gauge swatches, if for some reason you are worried that maybe you're on the cusp of needing just, you know, you're going to use up all 5 balls of yarn. And you're just like, man, if I do that gauge swatch, I don't know if I'll have enough yarn to finish my sweater. So I just won't do the gauge swatch. Well, let's think through this. If you make the sweater and it doesn't fit, you just wasted 5 balls, right? Best thing you could do, and this is, I tell everybody this, from people who are buying independent yarn that's like super expensive, or yarn that is affordable that like most of us buy, right? I just always buy an extra skein of yarn, an extra ball of yarn. And I know that that just means I have an extra ball of yarn. If I don't use it, it's at my house and I'm increasing my stash. But really, guys, is it going to go to waste? I mean, come on. I'm going to use it. I can make mittens, I can make a scarf, I could do all sorts of things. Or you can make yourself a crochet journal, and say you make up swatches like this. You can make a journal and say, okay, I used this size hook, I used this yarn, this is the date, these are the measurements that I got when I made it, and you can write it all down. So that way, maybe the next time you go back, you're like, oh, I used cheat sheet before, what did I get? You can take a look at it and see. Or like I buy these things. I have bigger ones too, but you know these little tag things, right? Like they have nice big ones you can buy, but you can write on here what hook you used, what yarn you used, what stitch you used if it was something special, and just tie it onto your swatch, and then just save your swatch. And then you could have like a basket full of swatches, and you could rummage through them, and it's like a little memory thing. And you can, if you want to use that yarn again, you can say, oh, this is what I used last time. This is what I got last time. You know what I mean? Like there's things to use it. So these are not wasteful. Now, having said that, can you take your swatch, rip it out, and use that yarn? Technically, yes, you could. However, I would only use that on like small portions of whatever your project would be. So like for me, if I was making a sweater and say I'm at the end of the sweater, I have no more yarn, and I'm just like up at the shoulder bit, I could take this out and I'm just using it for the shoulder bit, and maybe I use the rest to seam it up. But one thing you want to remember is as you're using yarn, you're changing, you're putting stress on the yarn, right? You're putting different stress. So it might get a different measurement. If you rip it out, work with it, rip it out, work with it, rip it out, work with it. It could lose its loftiness. It could lose its elasticity, and you might not get an actual real gauge, because gauge swatches lie, remember? So you could at one point in time say that you did this and it was 4 inches, and then after you've ripped it out and done it like 5 times, do it again, and now all of a sudden it's like 3.5 because you've stretched the yarn so much it's not as lofty. You're like, great, that's what I want, that's the perfect size. You go to make your item and it's back to 4 inches because now you're using yarn that has not been stretched and it has not lost its elasticity. So it's important to remember that as you're using this yarn, you are working with it quite a bit, right? So it gets used up. So people make fun of me. They laugh at me because they're like, oh, you're always telling people just to buy more yarn. I'm not going to tell you something that I don't do. I always buy an extra skein of yarn. I always do. And I think it to myself, that's my extra skein of yarn for my gauge swatch. And then if I like it, I'll use it for other things. If I don't like it, heck, I'm only out 1 ball of yarn. I could take the other yarn back, do you know what I mean? So yeah.
Awesome.
And as far as does a designer plan for the gauge swatch when they give you the yarn amounts? It is not written anywhere that we're supposed to. So I would hesitate to say, oh yeah, designers do that all the time. I would not trust that. I would always just kind of think to myself, I'm just going to get an extra skein. Or if you know for a fact, like maybe you're using larger balls of yarn, you're just like, okay, I know I'm not going to use 3 full balls. I'm going to use like 2.5. You know you have enough. You don't have to buy another ball. You know you have enough. Use your common sense with that. So yeah. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's another question here. So are you better off, this is from Angela. So are you better off trying to adjust to the right gauge or adjust to what your gauge is?
You need to crochet the way you're going to crochet. So don't be like, okay, I'm going to adjust the way I crochet to meet the gauge. You change your hook size to meet the gauge, okay? Now, where that is the most difficult is when you have a crocheter or a designer who wrote the gauge that maybe you guys have heard, I just lost the word. I think it's not magic loop. That's not the word. When they overextend the first pull up and then they finish off so their stitch is higher than if it's lower. Here, I'm gonna show you what I mean because it'll be easier. Let me show you down here. So there are some people who will crochet. Let me click here. Let me just turn my work here. And magic ring's not what I'm thinking of. It's this. So I'm going to do a double crochet. So there are some people who will go in, yarn over and pull up a loop, and then they pull this up really tall, and then they finish like this, right? So look how tall that double crochet is. Versus you go in, you pull up a loop, you pull it up to where your hook is angled. This is the way it should be done. It's supposed to be angled. You yarn over, you pull through. So now you've kind of essentially created a single crochet there, and then there's your other single crochet on top. So it's not like this really elongated stitch there. It's a double crochet. Now, both of these are double crochets. And here's another one where this was just nice and tight, but they're going to get different measurements for each one. So maybe the designer crochets like this, but you crochet like this. You don't want to change how you crochet to get like this. You want to change your hook size to get whatever that gauge is going to be. Does that make sense? I can't remember what this is called. There's a name for this. It's that loop right there that you're pulling up. There's a name for it. Like if you keep it a little bit where it's supposed to be, where you're kind of angled working it, or you pull it up real tall. Like it's a thing, guys. It's the way people crochet, right? Everybody crochets differently. So the best thing to do is change your hook to get the gauge. So if I needed a different hook size, like I could grab like, oh, what is this? This is my K hook. Yeah, this is my K hook. And I could come in here and, you know, I'm going to get a different gauge just based on the different hook size. I mean, look at that. It's super tall. Now, that height there with my K hook looks like it's about the same height that I got right there with my H hook. Can you see? So I changed my hook size to achieve the gauge that the designer could have gotten with that. Is that clear? Is that clear enough? So you always want to change your hook size. So again, if you remember, I don't care if you go up or down a hook size or 5 hook size to get gauge. It's important that we get those numbers, because those numbers are the ones the designer is using to get that measurement, right? Now, I love that I pulled off patterns of shawls, because I mean, obviously shawls, it really doesn't matter too much other than you want to make sure you have enough yarn to complete this. But you guys get the concept, right?
Yep.
Cool.
So there was a question here from Carol. So based on how you showed the gauge conversion, if you follow a pattern, how would you do the same conversion where they're giving you the 4-inch gauge swatch?
So if a pattern, you wouldn't want to convert it unless you're going to make changes. So like if you're like, I have a pattern, maybe it's a pattern that goes up to a 3X and you're a 5X. So you need like 4 more inches. So you're trying to figure out how many stitches do you need to add more. So that's where you would have to figure out what your stitch pattern repeat is. And then that's where you would break it down and make those changes. Now that gets a lot more complicated as you get up to the upper body portion and things are adjusted for armhole and neck and stuff. But let's take it even simpler. If you want to take a baby blanket, you love that stitch pattern. You're like, I want a king size blanket with this stitch pattern. It's the same. You would do just like that. You would make your gauge swatch, figure out either your stitch pattern repeat or your row repeat or your stitch per inch, and figure out what your multiple would be all the way across. So like, for example, let's go back down here. I'm going to move all this out of the way. So like I have this little piece right here. Let me see if it's going to pop down to my hands. There we go. So, oops, is it on my hands? Yes? Nope, not yet. Hold on, they're moving it. There we go. So this piece right here, this is a piece that this is a swatch I did up for a video that I did on YouTube for Red Heart. And it's just a basic chevron, right? And you might see, well, Marley, how do you measure this? Because we have stitches that are shaped, right? Like we're going up, we're increasing, we're going down. We're like, how would you measure something like this? Well, this is a case where I would measure the stitch pattern repeat. So for this repeat, it would be from the valley to the valley, right? So this is the repeat, and then these are what would be the extras on the outside. So I need to know what my stitch repeat is. So I could go from my valley to right over here. So it's 5 inches. Can you guys see that? So I'm at 5 inches. So I know that I don't remember how many stitches. Let's say this is 22 stitches. I know that if I want to make my piece across, every time I add a stitch repeat, every time I add like the peak and the valley, I'm adding 5 inches to my piece. And then I have to remember that from that side, it's 2.5, and that side will be 2.5. So it'll be 5 inches. So this one, 5 inches, 5 inches, 5 inches. And I have to remember by adding this half and this half, I'm adding a final 5 inches. Does that make sense? I'm going to bring in another example here. So this is the stitch pattern repeat. So for this one, even though these are all just double crochets, and you might be like, oh, wait, I could just measure my double crochets. It doesn't really give you a true account because we have increases and decreases. So this is where you would do the stitch pattern repeat. Same thing here. So this is a shawl I made, and it goes through a bunch of different stitches. So I'm going to hold this up here. So we start down here and we do corner to corner. So I measure corner to corner. And then we go, I don't even remember the name of the stitch. We go to this stitch. And then we go to this stitch. So I'm at 3 stitch pattern repeats. And then I go to a different stitch pattern. And so I have to, and this is 2 stitch pattern repeats, right? Because look, I have shells and double crochets here. So I have to know what my repeat is, the repeat is, and then I have the final double crochets here. And then I go to another one, and then I go to another one. So I really can't just measure these based on the stitches that are between my post here, right? I need to know what my repeats are. So I would count my repeats across. Am I making sense? Same thing with this. And then final, we have the cables, right? So you have to figure out what your repeats are, and then you can make adjustments. Did I answer questions?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay. The fun part about this is I think this is a really great example of, okay, look, you have all these different stitches. All of these stitches have a different stitch multiple. And so I had to figure out what was the multiple, and then how many stitches do I need so that my measurement from the end of this one to the next one, I think it was 2 inches. Yeah, is about 2 inches wider. Okay. And then this one, about 2 inches wider. You see that? Like I had to figure out, all right, how do I make it so that I just make them just 2 inches wider each one? And I did it purely by doing everything that we are talking about here. Just 2 inches. Oh, this one's a little bit wider. Oh, no, I was measuring wrong. We're at 2 inches wider. And then once I made all of these pieces like in stair steps, I went back and then I filled in the gaps like an entrelac sort of piece. And I just decreased at one end and joined to the opposite end. And again, I have to know what my stitch gauge is here for the single crochets and what my row gauge is. So that way I can say, okay, how many rows and how many stitches do I need to equal that 8 inches, that's 8 inches long, and then that 2 inches wide. And so I figure that out and I worked it. Does that make sense? So this is where all these numbers come into play. And you won't have to do anything like this because if you're following a pattern, all of this is already done for you. But this is just to show you the importance of saying, when a designer gives you the gauge and it's like, hey, if you want to make this, make sure you're getting these numbers. This is why it's important. Because if all of a sudden this one here, say it's supposed to be 2 inches wider and yours is 3 inches wider and your stitch gauge is exactly what this is, it's not going to fit, right? You with me? It's like you're putting together puzzle pieces, but if you all of a sudden put your puzzle piece in some sort of a, I almost said Honey, I Shrunk the Kids sort of thing, but you know what I mean? It's not going to fit anymore. And so you need to make sure everything fits. Okay, how am I doing? Does that answer a lot of the questions? I mean, you could go hours into row gauge and stitch multiples and figuring out math and actually going into like designer courses sort of stuff. But for this, I really wanted to make sure everybody understood, you know, what is that crazy thing gauge that is always given on my patterns? What does it mean? How do I measure it? And so you know what it means now, right? It's what the designer uses to get what the piece is. And as far as measuring it, I always make my swatches bigger, you guys. And you just saw, like, we're measuring over 9 inches over just trying to get that little 4 inches or even 2 inches. It's so much better to go go big, go big or go home, right? You want it bigger. You definitely want it bigger. It's easier to measure and you get a more accurate measurement.
We had a question come here from Cindy. What about when working in the rounds for something like a hat?
Ooh, okay. So that's a very good question. If you're going to work in the round for a hat or for socks or anything like that, you want to make sure you're doing your gauge swatch in the round. All right. I know that sounds funny, but you actually crochet differently when you're working in the round than when you're working flat. So like I just did a crochet along with my friend Ron Strong where he designed crochet socks. And one of the things we talked about at the start was if you want these socks to fit, you need to make sure that you're doing your gauge swatch in the round. And so when I do my gauge swatch in the round, that is where I will still take my total number and I'll take several different measurements. I'll take whatever my total number is. And then I put it down flat and then I kind of measure it across to kind of see what would that be, the diameter, I don't know, these are math terms. I feel like I'm feel like I'm using a different language. Whatever it is, I measure it flat and then if I'm making a hat, I'll try and measure it in the round the best I can. So I play around with it. But still, I mean, the bigger your swatch, the better it is, in my opinion. Yeah, does that answer the question? So if you're making something around, you want to make sure you're doing your gauge swatch in the round. And that goes for knitting also.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Another question here from Kirsten. Please go over whether to use a larger, does she need to size up in her hook?
Okay.
Or down?
Okay.
To meet the desired gauge.
Right. That can be tricky to understand. So let's think about this. I'm trying to think of the best way to demonstrate. I don't think I have a way to demonstrate other than just talking through it. Okay. If I want, let's say this is 1 inch. All right. So I have 5 stitches. I'm crocheting along. I get 5 stitches in this inch. Perfect. We're on gauge. But let's say if I am crocheting along and I get 4 stitches in this inch, that means my stitches are bigger, right? Because if I had 5, if I'm getting 4 now, that means these are bigger because they're taking up that whole inch. You with me? So if these stitches are bigger and I want to make them smaller, what do I need to do? I see you. I know you guys are saying it. Go down. Carrie's right.
Yep.
You go down a hook size because I need them smaller so that I can get that 5. Now, if I'm getting 6, that means they're too small because now I'm getting too many in that inch. So I will go up. That's right, Linda. So then I would go up a hook size, right? So does that make sense? Like even still today, I have to think through that myself. It's one of those, it's kind of counterintuitive. You're like, oh, I need 5 and I'm only getting 4. So I'm gonna go down. Yeah. So it's just one of those things. I just have to think through it. I'm like, okay, I'm getting you know how I do it? Instead of thinking, oh, I'm getting too many or I'm getting too few, I look at it and I'm like, oh, those are too big. I need them to be smaller. Oh, those are too small. I need them to be bigger. So versus thinking I have too many or too few, I think of them as they're too big or too small. Because then I can think logically, okay, if they're too big, I need to make them smaller. I'll use a smaller hook. If they're too small, I need to make them bigger. I'll use a bigger hook. Okay. Now, if that doesn't work for you and you have to think the other way around, totally fine. That doesn't make you abnormal at all. It's just another way to think through things. We all learn differently. And that's the biggest thing through all of this is this is how I understand gauge. Now, there are other people, other designers out there who are much more technical, much more mathy than I am, and they can really get in depth with it. That is not me. I am not your girl, okay? My gauge is like, I'm like, that's about what it is. You know what I mean? And it's tricky, but that's where we are. I do want to say one thing, though, for those of you who are going to be going into making garments and stuff, especially if you're larger size. So I'm not a small girl. I'm a large girl. So my garment, I wear usually a 2X, 3X. It's going to have on average double the amount of yarn that somebody who's making a small, right? That means it's going to be heavier. So if you're going to be making a garment and you're doing your gauge swatch, you need to somehow account for the weight of your garment as well so that you are pre-planning that. Meaning, if if you're doing your gauge swatch, everything looks awesome, your grow gauge is right on, you could make your item and you didn't really account for the fact that maybe you're using a yarn that's kind of heavy. So now you've made your 2X sweater and it's really heavy and it's really pulling on those stitches. So what was once a crop top is now a duster, okay? So you need to plan for that. So one thing you could do is after you've done your swatches, what did I do with my swatches? After you've done your swatch, now this is not really as important with acrylic as far as you can't really block acrylic unless you're going to steam it and stuff, but that's a whole nother story. But you need to wash your swatch and block it. And the reason you're doing that is you want to know how your fabric is going to act after you wash your sweater, and you want to know how your fabric is going to act after it's been worn all day long. So here's what you're gonna do. You make your swatch, you measure it. This is most important if you're making garments, okay? If you're making blankets and stuff, not as important. This is garments. I'm talking to the garment crocheters. You make your swatch, you measure it. You wash it, you block it, you unpin it once it's dry, let it rest for a little bit, measure it again. Do the two measurements, the one you did before blocking and the one after blocking. Have they changed the size of your gauge swatch? Because that's important. Because if it was 4 inches and now it's 8 inches, something's not going to look right when you make your sweater, right? That's not going to work. And you need to know that before you put all that time in your sweater. So say they're the same. Say it was 4 inches, you blocked it, you washed it, and it's still 4 inches. Great, you're like, awesome. Now, what about wearing it all day? Let's say you wear it on average 8 hours. So what I do is, you guys know those like pant hangers where you fold it like this and it opens up and then you can clamp it. It clamps on like a pant hanger. So I get those pant hangers and I will clamp the pant hanger over my swatch. And then I take clothespins and I add it to the bottom of my swatch to simulate gravity. And then I let it hang for 8 hours. When it's all done, I unpin it and I measure it again to see, did it grow? Now, if it only grew just a little tiny bit, that's great. Your garment is going to fit great. It's not going to expand. You're not going to end up with like a big train, or you know what I mean? Everything's going to be great. But if it grew immensely, you could be like, hot dang, I can't use this. This is not the right yarn choice for this piece. Okay. This is most important usually if you're going to change your yarn up, because usually designers have done this for you. But it's important to know those things. Now, on that same note, every single book I've read, every single class I've taken on being a designer, everything has told me designers are supposed to give you what the blocked gauge is. So that means the gauge that is given on these patterns, that is considered a blocked gauge. Now, the great thing is if you're using just acrylic yarn and stuff, you don't really have to block acrylic yarn too much. I mean, there's different things you could do, as I mentioned. We can go over that some other time. But you don't really have to worry about it too much. But if you're using some sort of a natural fiber, like an alpaca yarn or a wool yarn or a silk or a cotton or anything like that, you need to make sure that your swatch, it might be this to start, but after you wash it or after you wear it or after it adds some weight to it, it might not be that same size, and you need to know that. Now, the hard part there is, as far as I'm concerned, most designers, if there's a big difference, if it's like, okay, you're going to make this swatch and it's going to measure 3 inches, but then once you block it, you're going to really stretch and block this out to 6 inches. They'll let you know that in a pattern. They're not going to just say, oh, the gauge is 6 inches. And you're crocheting along with your C hook. You're like, how the heck did this person get 6 inches, right? So usually a pattern will tell you that kind of stuff. And this is really advanced stuff I'm giving you here, but I want to make sure at least it's in your brain. You've heard it at some point in time. In the future, if somebody says something along the lines, you're like, I remember one time there was this girl on Michaels that told us something. It'll trigger something. So I just want to make sure you're aware of that out there. That especially if you're doing garments, you might have to do more than just a little gauge swatch. There's a little bit more work into it. And that's also where I really feel like a crochet journal is handy, because you can type in there, or not type in, but write in, you know, this was my pre-block, this is my post-block, this is the hook, this is what I did, this is that. And then you have a record. So the next time you go to the store and you buy Peyton's Grace, whatever it may be, you can say, okay, so the last time I did a swatch with this, this is what it did. is this a good yarn choice for this piece that I'm making? And you can make an educated decision, because you are going to be your biggest advocate in that yarn aisle, right? We all know, come on, you know, you go through that yarn aisle and you love it when other people are there picking out yarn. You're like, what are you going to make? And then they ask you a question and they're like, who do you think this is good yarn? Well, you can really make that perfect suggestion now, right? I mean, I can see you guys are laughing because you know it's true. You know it's true. Like, I love going to the yarn aisle and seeing people there choosing yarn. I'm always like, what are you making? You know, tell me what you're making. And it's exciting because we bond together as crocheters, you know. It's like our own little society. It's like we should have a secret handshake or something, right? I love it. So anyways, that's another big thing. But again, we could go hours into that.
I will say another question that came through is, will they list 2 gauges if there are multiple hook sizes? If you change hook size throughout the pattern?
All of the patterns I've seen, yes. And having said that, if you've gone through, I think the CGOA stuff, it's actually not recommended if you are doing some sort of a sizing on stuff that you change hook size to adjust sizes. Like, it's frowned upon. You're supposed to adjust whatever. I don't know. I do it. I change hook sizes if I'm just looking for small adjustments. I think it makes sense. But yes, typically a designer will put that information in there. If they haven't, I mean, there's no hard and fast rule that they have to, but typically they will. I mean, for the most part, designers want you to make their stuff, so they'll give you all the information you need, because it's really cool when we see you making our stuff.
Awesome. I'm not seeing any other questions
I've
at
left
the
them
moment.
Speechless.
You've received many compliments on your scarf.
Oh, thank you.
I let them know it's a wrap sprinkles, and you can find that on marleybird.com.
Yes.
It's one of Marley's patterns.
Yes, I love this. It's really easy just to throw on. And it's long. It's really long. And go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, there is a lot of people who really have, like, now that they've sat here and you've explained it and they've thought about it more, a lot of this is making a lot of sense.
Right. Now, I figure I might say something else here, because I've heard this talked about a little bit on YouTube from various YouTubers who maybe just don't know better. I don't know. They'll say, oh, figure out what your chain multiple is and just chain out as long as you want it to be. So they'll say, oh, your chain multiple is 3 stitches, 3 chains, and just keep doing 3 chains until your chain is about as long as you want your blanket to be. Well, yeah, in theory, you could do that. But if you're doing something like shells, or you're doing cables, or you're doing some sort of stitch that pinches things in, that's not accurate. Your chain is not a good representation of how big your piece is going to be. So it's very important you work through your actual rows and stitches to figure out what your chain, or not your chain, what your gauge is. Basing your gauge just on the chain length is not good. And for those of you who have just willy-nilly chained a certain number and just gone into like double crochets or something, you know that's true. Like, you're just like, whoa, all of a sudden this is huge, and you're making like some sort of oversized blanket for a couch or something, and it was supposed to be a throw. Like, because we've all done it, because it's like, oh, I don't want to do that, but you can. But here's a note: if you've done that, just make it about 5 inches and call it a scarf, and then you have an oversized scarf. You have a super scarf.
A great question here. So what if you want to use a heavier yarn than what the pattern calls for?
So if you're doing a pattern that has a lot of sizing to it, that's going to be a lot more complicated. But if you're just looking to use a heavier yarn for a blanket or something, just do your gauge swatch in your heavier yarn. And at that point, you're becoming the designer. You're essentially using whatever design it is. Like, say you're using, as I throw it away, you're using this design. You're like, I like that, but I want to do it in grand scale. I want to make it, I'm going to use like grande. And so you work this up using grande. And what was my, 5 by 4 inch square or rectangle or whatever the heck this is, now all of a sudden you've used grande and you're like, okay, mine is 9 by 10. So then you use that, you're saying, I'm going to put 9 by 10 squares all around. And so then you've become the designer. You know what I mean? That's where you're purely just using the stitch pattern or the stitch repeat that the designer used in their design to create your own.
Bev wants to know if for a crochet motif, do you just use, do you make one and then measure?
So I do two, because my first one is usually the one I'm learning the stitch on. And then I make the second one and it's usually a little bit more snug because I'm like, oh, now I'm in the habit of it. So, I mean, those of you who have done that, come on, I'm not the only one where you've made it. You're like, they're all supposed to be the same size. I use the same hook. And so I usually will do a couple. And then if they're join as you go, I'll make one and then I'll make the second one as the join as you go. And then I'll do the third one and I'll do the fourth one. And then I measure the four together. That's what I do. It could be overkill. If it's a big square, like if you're talking like 12 by 12, I make one. But if it's something like this, I will make a few, because it's always the first one. I'm really learning the stitch. I'm learning what colors I want to use. I'm learning what I need to do. The second one, I've already got that first kind of round under my hat. So I'm ready to, and it stitches up a nice tighter and cleaner. And it's more representative of what the rest of my squares will be.
Awesome. And then we've received a couple of questions. If you know of any resources for crochet journaling or how they can get started.
So I've always just made my own. So you could use like a Cricut machine and really just go to town with like scrapbooking sort of thing. So you could get like a scrapbooker piece and use sticker. I mean, you could have fun with it, right? You can use, I know there are actual crochet journals out there and the names are absolutely escaping me. But I mean, you could get a 3-ring binder.
In another, I think Seema showed us in another class, she had a 3-ring binder with page protectors. So she would slide her gauge swatch into the page protector and then she had a piece of paper in there as well.
Now, I know, like, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, like on my podcast, I think next week I have somebody coming on to talk about like a project binder sort of thing. And it's along the same lines, creating one at home. But yeah, like really you could do anything, like just put them together. And those tags, like I love those tags. And I know that they sell at Michael's. Like it's a box about this big and it's, I think like $10, maybe $20. I can't remember. I might've used a coupon, but it has like really colorful big tags in it with the string. And I use those all the time on my swatches. And I have like oodles and gobs of them. And I just write the information on there. And I usually will write the date just so that I know how long ago it was. And if you do a journal, like if you have made something, you still have your ball band, you could stick the ball band in there. Like there's all things. I mean, it's your own tool. It just put in the information that you want for you.
Charlene said that they have some great options at Dollar Store. And then Raina said, what about using an old CD organizer?
That would work.
Yeah.
You'd have to figure out how to, I've never thought about that. All mine are filled up with old CDs, which my kids now are like, Mom, you have Footloose? I'm like, yes, I do. Man, Mom, that is so old. I'm like, I'm old. Now I'm on a tangent. Yeah, you probably could. I mean, just put them in there, or even sheet protectors. You could put things in sheet protectors. Lots of different ways.
I think maybe, possibly, we have an idea for a future class. So
there you go.
That brought up some good conversation there.
I love it. I love it. This is, I mean, you guys, kudos to you for being here, because this is information, like Allie and I were talking about it. This is stuff that like you can lead crocheters to water, but you can't make them drink, right? So like everybody kind of hears that word gauge. Everybody knows that it might be important. I don't really want to do it. It's extra work. But you all are here to understand and learn and become better crocheters for it. And I commend you for that. Like I really, I really think it's important. I do want to tell you, like, if you go on, you're like, but I did my gauge swatch, it's just coming out funny. You know what? You could have been extra stressed one day when you were crocheting and it could come out a little bit tighter. You could be over relaxed. I mean, gosh, that would be awesome, right? Like whatever it may be. So that's the part where I joke around about gauge swatches is that there are extenuating circumstances that can affect the way you crochet too. So just give yourself a break. But you can take what you've learned today. And for those of you who are like, I hate following a pattern, I start off with the pattern and then I veer off on my own little way. You are like a budding designer. Congratulations. Continue to do that. Become a designer. Use this information and create things on your own and become a designer. Because eventually you'll stop following other people's patterns at all, and you'll just start making your own, because this is where it starts. These are your Lego pieces. Now go build your Lego house. You know what I mean? Yeah. And that's, I don't know if I could copy, I mean, it's copyrighted, trademarked Lego. You know what I mean?
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody so much. You'll see the links up here in the chat for
Hi, Charlene.
where you can find the recording of today's class, and then where you can find our upcoming classes. We do have a class on knit gauge on Saturday, and then a couple of other great classes coming up as well. So be sure to check out those. And thank you so much, Marley, for this class. I learned a lot.
Did you learn a lot? Awesome.
I did.
Awesome. That's great. That's great.
Charlene is also saying yes. So
awesome. That's fantastic. That makes me really happy. Now you guys can go make, like, you can make that sweater. You know what I mean? There's all sorts of things. You can make all sorts of fun things.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. And we are, we'll see you next time.
All right. Bye, guys.
Bye, everyone.